Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. On January 29, 1861, Kansas became the 34th state admitted to the Union, a free state. And I suppose that sounds like a straightforward triumph for the anti-slavery cause. In that case, I need to tell you what actually happened, because the story of Kansas statehood is one of the bloodiest, most morally complicated chapters in American history. Here's what fascinates me about this moment. Kansas only became a state that day because the senators who would have blocked it had just walked out of Congress. 6 southern states had already seceded. The men who had fought for 7 years to make Kansas a slave state were, at that very moment, tearing the nation apart. Kansas slipped through the door they left open on their way out. Understanding what happened requires holding multiple truths at once. The anti-slavery forces won. They also committed atrocities. The democratic experiment of popular sovereignty was tested in Kansas, and what it revealed about democracy wasn't pretty. Both things are true. Both things matter. Picture this. It's March 30th, 1855, and voters in the Kansas Territory are choosing their first territorial legislature. The polls close, the ballots are counted, and somehow 6,307 votes have been cast in a territory with only 2,905 eligible voters. The math doesn't work because the election wasn't real. Thousands of Missourians had crossed the border that morning, armed and organized to stuff the ballot boxes. They called themselves border ruffians, and they weren't subtle about their methods. Vote, go home. Come back the next election and do it again. Territorial Governor Andrew Reeder set aside the results in 6 districts and ordered new elections. The Free State candidates won those, but the pro-slavery faction had already seized control of the legislature, and they weren't giving it up. They met at Pawnee, then moved to Lecompton, and they passed laws so draconian that merely speaking against slavery became a felony. 2 governments now claimed authority over Kansas, 2 constitutions, 2 visions of what this territory would become, and between them, murder. The pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution became the flashpoint. In 1857, a convention dominated by slavery supporters drafted a constitution that would have made Kansas a slave state. They knew they couldn't win a fair vote, so they rigged the ratification process. Voters could choose the Constitution with slavery or with no slavery, but even the no slavery option protected the rights of slaveholders already in Kansas. It was a choice between 2 versions of the same outcome. Free state settlers boycotted the vote entirely. The Lecompton Constitution passed with over 6,000 votes in favor. Then, when the territorial legislature held a fair referendum a few months later, Kansas voters rejected it by more than 10,000 votes. The will of the people was clear, but the Buchanan administration pushed Congress to accept Lecompton anyway. Let me build the clock for you, because you can't understand bleeding Kansas without understanding what Congress had done the year before. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was supposed to solve a problem. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois wanted a transcontinental railroad, and he wanted it to run through Chicago. But to make that happen, the Nebraska Territory had to be organized. Southern senators wouldn't support organizing free territory. It would tip the balance of power against them. So Douglas offered a deal. Let the settlers decide. Popular sovereignty. Let the people of Kansas and Nebraska vote on whether to allow slavery. It sounds democratic, it was meant to sound democratic, but what it actually did was turn Kansas into a battlefield. Both sides understood the stakes. If settlers could vote slavery in or out, then the side that sent more settlers would win. Immigrant aid societies formed in New England, funding free state settlers' westward migration. Missouri slaveholders organized their own migration, and when that wasn't enough, they simply crossed the border on election days. The violence that followed earned Kansas a name that stuck: Bleeding Kansas. Historians have documented at least 56 political killings during this period. The actual number may have been closer to 200, and those numbers don't capture the burned homes, the midnight raids, the families driven off their land at gunpoint. The town of Fort Scott became a microcosm of the whole conflict. Two hotels faced each other across the old parade ground: the Free State Hotel and the Western Hotel, also called the Pro-Slavery Hotel. Radicals from both sides terrorized the town. In 1858, a Free State leader named James Montgomery fought a pitched battle against U.S. Army troops stationed there. A deputy marshal named John Little was shot and killed looking out a window. His fiancée, Sean Campbell, wrote Montgomery a letter that still survives. "You, a minister of God? You mean a minister of the devil? And a very superior one, too." That letter captures something important. These weren't abstract political positions. These were neighbors who had come to hate each other with a fury that made murder feel like justice. I find myself thinking about John Brown when I consider this period, and I suspect you know that name. Brown was an abolitionist, a religious zealot, and, depending on who's telling the story, either a freedom fighter or a terrorist. He moved to Kansas in 1855, following 5 of his sons who had already settled there. On the night of May 24th, 1856, Brown and a small group of followers descended on pro-slavery homesteads along Pottawatomie Creek. They dragged 5 men from their cabins and hacked them to death with broadswords. The victims weren't slaveholders. They were poor settlers who supported slavery's expansion. Brown believed he was doing God's work. The Free State movement he claimed to represent was horrified. 3 days earlier, a pro-slavery mob had sacked the town of Lawrence, burning the Free State Hotel, destroying 2 newspaper offices, and terrorizing the population. Brown saw Pottawatomie as retribution. Many abolitionists quietly agreed, even as they publicly condemned the killings. This is where the moral complexity gets uncomfortable. The anti-slavery cause was right. Slavery was evil. But the methods used to fight it in Kansas included murder, arson, and vigilante justice. The pro-slavery forces committed atrocities too. The Lawrence raid, countless smaller attacks, the systematic fraud that corrupted every election. Neither side held the moral high ground on tactics. Only on the fundamental question of human bondage did one side stand clearly in the right. By 1858, the Free State faction had finally gained the upper hand. They'd won enough legitimate elections to control the territorial legislature. In October 1859, Kansas voters approved the Wyandotte Constitution, which banned slavery by a margin of nearly 2-1. But Southern senators still controlled Congress. They refused to admit Kansas as a free state. The Wyandotte Constitution sat waiting, blocked indefinitely. Then came the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. He wasn't even on the ballot in most of the South. South Carolina seceded in December. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed in January. And as those senators resigned their seats and walked out of the Capitol, Kansas was suddenly, finally, admitted to the Union. January 29th, 1861. The vote happened within days of the Southern Exodus. Kansas became a free state, not because the democratic process had worked, but because the men who had corrupted that process for 7 years had given up on democracy altogether. Here's what troubles me about this story, and I think it should trouble us still. Popular sovereignty was supposed to be the democratic solution to an impossible problem. Let the people decide. But what happened in Kansas showed that when the stakes are high enough, democracy itself becomes a weapon. Fraudulent elections, voter intimidation, political violence. The will of the people meant nothing when armed men could manufacture whatever result they wanted. We like to believe that democracy is self-correcting, that given enough time, the truth wins out, the right side prevails. Kansas suggests something darker. The anti-slavery cause won in Kansas not because democracy worked, but because their opponents abandoned the field. And even after statehood, the killing continued. In August 1863, William Quantrill led a band of pro-Confederate guerrillas into Lawrence, the same town that had been sacked 7 years earlier. This time they murdered approximately 180 men and boys. They rode through the streets shouting, "Remember Osceola!" Revenge for an earlier Jayhawker raid into Missouri. The cycle of violence that began in 1854 didn't end with statehood. It didn't even pause. We're still living with questions that Bleeding Kansas raised. How does a democracy resolve fundamental moral conflicts? What happens when one side refuses to accept the legitimacy of elections? How do we hold people accountable for political violence without becoming the thing we oppose? Think about the pattern that played out in Kansas. One side believed an institution was so evil that normal political processes couldn't be trusted to end it. The other side believed their way of life was under attack by outsiders who didn't respect their rights. Both sides convinced themselves that the other was acting illegitimately. Both sides concluded that extraordinary measures were justified. And once that logic took hold, the killing became self-sustaining. Every atrocity demanded revenge. Every revenge created a new grievance. The journalist and historian Jay Monahan called Kansas the tragic prelude to the Civil War. He was right about that. But I think Kansas was also a kind of laboratory, a place where Americans discovered exactly how far they would go to impose their vision of the future on their neighbors. The answer, it turned out, was very far indeed. The philosopher William James once wrote that the hell to be endured hereafter, of which theology tells, is no worse than the hell we make for ourselves in this world. Kansas in the 1850s was that kind of hell, created by human choices, sustained by human hatreds, ended only when one side marched off to create a larger hell elsewhere. So what do I take from January 29th, 1861? I believe Kansas was a genuine victory for human freedom. The anti-slavery cause was right, and they won. I also believe that victory was achieved through methods that included fraud, violence, and murder on all sides, and that the manner of victory matters, not just the outcome. And I believe we're still living in a country that hasn't fully reckoned with what Bleeding Kansas revealed about ourselves. All three of those things are true. All three of them matter. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, I want you to consider this. What would you have done if you were a free state settler in Kansas in 1856? Border ruffians just burned your neighbor's barn. John Brown is recruiting men for a raid. Do you pick up a rifle? Do you pack up your family and leave? Or do you stay, vote, and hope that democracy still means something, even when you've watched 3 elections stolen at gunpoint? Because that's what Bleeding Kansas teaches us. Not just about slavery, but about what happens when we stop believing in the legitimacy of our own institutions. When winning becomes more important than how we win. When ordinary people convince themselves that extraordinary violence is justified because the cause is righteous enough. We're still asking those questions, and I'm not sure we found better answers than the ones Kansas provided in blood. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with me. I genuinely appreciate everyone who tunes in. If you found this episode valuable, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to subscribe or follow the show. It's the single best way to make sure you don't miss tomorrow's story. And if you have a minute to leave a rating or review, I want you to know that those really do matter. They help other history lovers find us. And honestly, I read every single one. It means more than you might think. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other.